It is rare that good news stories come from war, and that is certainly true of the war in Laos, but humanity does surface in every war. Today's story is about good hearted, hard-working Americans who gave their lives and soul to the Hmong people of Laos, and young Hmong girls who gave up traditional societal roles to courageously serve their cause and their people, a people who in turn have become model Americans and have contributed so much to America's success. And this success has to do with how talented the Hmong people are. U.S. Air Force trainers stated in this film that they had trained pilots from all over the world, and among those they trained, the Hmong were the best, the most talented.
Who are these guys? They fly 8, 9, 10 missions a day. That's impossible.
Each one of us that ended up at UNORN were all instructors before. We had instructed various national pilots from around the world. We'd had Vietnamese, we'd had Iranians, Saudis, a lot of South Americans, stuff like that.
The Hmong were by far the most dedicated of all. They worked the hardest, and it meant the most to them to accomplish their goal of being a pilot.
They were the most dedicated and skillful people that I think any of us ever saw.
During the war in Laos, young Hmong and other tribal girls left their villages to become nurses at a time when women in Southeast Asia were typically only mothers, housekeepers, and farmers. The female nurse program was a revolutionary cultural change that broke traditions and speaks to the Hmong culture as one very skillful and adaptable. I also show in this video a film special about Pop Buell, a man who gave his life working for the Hmong, the film coming from the CBS network, which produced a documentary series called The 20th Century. This story begins with Dr. Charles Weldon and his wife, Dr. Patricia McReedy, two Americans from very rural, humble origins who decided early on to dedicate their lives to helping others. Weldon became the chief of the medical program for the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, in Laos. It was an almost overwhelming responsibility, training locals in the medical field and establishing remote medical centers in the most rural hamlets in Laos, bringing Western medicines to cultures that had only shamans as medical doctors previously.
Dr. Charles Weldon is Public Health Chief of the USAID mission in Laos.
Up until about 3.5 years ago, the only medical tradition that they had was based on superstition, and it's only been about in the last 3.5 years that POP has started to develop these rather crude dispensaries and hospital facilities and to train people from the mountains to give the medical care. We unfortunately have a very heavy load of war wounded. Probably at least half of the patients are people who've been injured by different types of war accidents. The other half of the patients are usually suffering from malnutrition, malaria, respiratory diseases, and different types of intestinal disorders.
Vitamin deficiencies and the ravages of war afflicted rural populations, and worse, the war created refugees, populations moving great expanses. But hard work, patience, and with a local indigenous population cooperating, the Weldons, with the cooperation of many, eventually trained across Laos 3,500 medical workers who participated in the village health program. Weldon writes about his time as a country doctor in Laos as he describes himself. Quote,
Probably the most frustrating problem in the early years of the village health program was getting the leaders to accept the idea of a girl becoming a nurse or any sort of health worker. It was strictly a man's world. Chow Mai, The Yao leader was a bit more liberal than most of the other tribal leaders. He reluctantly gave his consent, and we were able to get Yao and Lao Tung girls into training at Nam Dui without too much difficulty. At Sam Tong, the feeling about females was much different. Vang Pao and the other clan chieftains were initially strongly opposed to the training of girls. Many reasons were given why such training was impossible. Married women could not work in a hospital. The unmarried girls were too young. The male patients would not accept nursing care from a woman, particularly not from a young unmarried woman. Women didn't have enough sense to be trained. Women were too lazy to do such work. On and on. If the unmarried girls lived at the hospital, the boys would seduce them.
In traditional Hmong society, while women could be medicine women and shamans, men traditionally dominated these roles. Women were expected to care for children, manage household chores, and work in the fields. Gender roles were defined, and it was considered taboo for women to take on roles beyond these traditional assignments. All that changed in 1965 when American registered nurse Diana D. Dick arrived at Sam Tong, Lao with the organization International Voluntary Service, or IVS. For a pretty young single girl from the U.S., the jungle of North Lao was not the most desirable and pleasant place to live. To be thrust into that remote atmosphere in the middle of a war to supervise a primitive hospital filled with battle casualties was a soul-shaking experience. There had never been a Western female working at Sam Tong or any other site north of the capital, Vientiane, before, and of course the staff of the hospital was all male at the time. She began working 7 days a week under grueling conditions, from dawn until late in the night.
The first thing we learned when we first got there was that in Laos there were only 7 doctors at the time when they arrived. A country of 2 million people, 7 doctors wasn't quite enough to take care of everybody. So the first thing they did was that they were working with a Filipino organization, Operation Brotherhood. They came in, brought doctors and nurses to come in and work. They got support from USAID to build hospitals and also develop clinics in the various regional areas. But the problem was that Mom and Dad didn't feel that it was right, that somebody else was always doing it. They wanted to offer people there the opportunity to do it themselves and to contribute to their own country, just as they had. Then people were saying, well, they live in the middle of nowhere. We don't have any schools. We don't have a medical school. We don't have a nursing school. We don't have any of that. And, how are they going to learn? They can't go off and study. And, how are we going to develop that? So we learned over time, sitting around the table, that Mom would always talk about programs and plans to build hospitals in different places. And of course, Dad was always very concerned that people on the ground in their villages should also have an opportunity to serve and to help. So one of the things that they worked upon was coming up with an idea originally to begin with physician assistants that would be trained on site in the hospitals that were being built because they didn't have the medical school yet. They got the physician assistants starting, mostly men, starting and helping the doctors who were some Lao doctors, Thai doctors, American doctors that came and helped in the various hospitals. And then, of course, Mom said, okay, where are the women? Mom was a woman doctor, quite unusual at the time. She had become a doctor because she received a scholarship for her studies. She studied hard. And it was not so easy for women to get into medical school in those days and to become a doctor. In fact, when I was born, her obstetrician was the first Black woman doctor in the state where I was born. Her name was Rebecca. She had been named after the very first Black woman doctor in the United States. And she named me Rebecca.
Soon after Dee's arrival, Dr. Weldon hired a Hmong girl to work with her, recruited when she was 13 years old. Chua Thao was married to a Lao boy who worked in the U.S. in Vientiane. She was an intelligent, mature young woman, and being fluent in English as well as Lao and Hmong, she was the ideal counterpart to Dee and an invaluable asset to the program. Vang Pao and the other Hmong leaders had not given Dr. Weldon permission to start a regular training program for girls, but in spite of their resistance, Dr. Weldon recruited 7 girls who functioned as apprentices to Dee and Chua. 2 were Hmong, 2 Lao, 2 Lao Tung, and 1 Tai Dam. This was a revolutionary moment in culture for rural village headmen and their villagers to provide young girls to faraway Sam Tong to be nurses. Very surprisingly, no Hmong leaders complained when they saw the girls in the hospital.
She felt it was very important to offer the opportunity to women, young women, to follow their goals in helping their communities. So the idea came out that it wasn't going to be a matter of applying to schools per se and just waiting for somebody to get the certain level of education, take all the exams, and go on to study this and study that. But that the question would be asked in the villages themselves. And this is how the nursing program really started up in the area in the Hmong villages. But not only Hmong, also Yao, other ethnic groups, and also Lao groups, where they were asked by local leadership, who's interested in looking after sick people? And families would come together and say, well, you know, my daughter's been pretty good at that. You know, she's quite interested in traditional medicine, and she's always looking after auntie and grandmother and making sure everyone's okay. And, you know, maybe she would be a good person. And so the recommendations would come from the villages themselves. And then each village would make a series of recommendations of young women who were interested in getting involved in nursing. And some of them actually went on to study medicine, but getting into nursing. And then they would be interviewed and offered the opportunity to be trained.
USAID refugee worker Ernest Kuhn says,
This was a tremendous social upheaval in North Lao to take 15, 16, 17-year-old Lao Hmong and Lao Tung girls out of their villages and bring them down to Samtong for training.
this came about at a time when the communist Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese began an offensive east of the Plain of Jars. Dr. Weldon and Pop Buell set up a forward operating hospital to care for the incoming refugees at Mong Cha, Lao. Dr. Weldon says within 2 weeks they were caring for 30,000 people, and every day more and more straggled out of the jungle. Most of them had lost their possessions. All were starving and demoralized. The Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese at Pu Nong had set up an ambush for retreating villagers. The ones who escaped had bullet and shrapnel wounds. Some of them could not talk coherently and wandered aimlessly even though they could hardly stand. The medical needs were so great that without asking permission from Hmong leaders, Dr. Weldon and Pop Buell brought Chua and the 7 nurses to Mong Cha. The next day, Vang Pao saw the girls, exchanged a few pleasant words with Chua and the nurses, and everyone acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. You must understand the North Vietnamese specifically targeted hospitals and medical personnel, an action history best reported on and demonstrated in Thailand, where the communist guerrillas attacked the medical establishment. So the Hmong nurses are to be commended for their sacrifice and bravery in placing themselves in harm's way as part of the war effort. In 1972, Dr. McReedy testified before the U.S. Senate on health efforts in Laos, and she testified that a few days after the North Vietnamese captured Pak Song, they torched the hospital and blamed it on U.S. bombing, although there was no U.S. air activity in the area after the battle. A few days later, Vang Pao, we'll call him VP, pulled Buell and Dr. Weldon aside and said he wanted to talk about the nurses. Weldon says that VP said these women were doing a good job and wondered why they hadn't recruited more. Weldon said he decided to poke VP a little and asked, "I thought taking care of sick people was men's work among the Hmong, General." "Certainly not. Women can take care of sick people just as well or better than men can," VP replied. Weldon says VP knew that he was getting even with him for obstructing the training of girls in the past, and that VP was simply trying to tell Weldon that he had been wrong without losing face. Soon after the Mong Cha episode, D inaugurated regular training courses for girls, and the program was even more successful than all had anticipated. Of note, Nurse Chua Thao first started working for Pop Buell in 1959 on the Plain of Jars at Lat Huang and was the interpreter for Diana Dick when the nurse training program began. Nurse Cao Zhang was the first Hmong woman to be sent to the U.S. for medical training to Minnesota, and Dr. Westmeyer sponsored her. Being nurses and having trained at Samtong gave the girls status and greatly increased their marriage eligibility and their bride price. No doubt, the increased bride price influenced parents to get them into training. Dr. Weldon writes,
"It was amazing to me how rapidly these illiterate young people progressed. They had good minds and were highly motivated and determined to succeed. At the beginning of the program, most of the trainees were very young. The boys were 14 or 15 and the girls were only 12 or 13. Nevertheless, they were much more mature than Western youngsters at the same age. Most of the older boys in the tribal groups were already soldiers and not available to train as civilian medics. The girls usually married at 15 or 16.
Dr. Weldon explained that the girls had to be recruited at such a young age because it would be too late to recruit them at 15 or 16 when they were married. Weldon says the original 7 nurses who had gone to Mong Cha with Chua to help the Pu Nong refugees became known as the 7. They held a special place in everyone's esteem. It was an honor to be one of the 7. They were always pointed out at parties and ceremonies and received special attention and courtesies. Having broken some of the rigid bonds that tribal custom and tradition placed on women, the 7 were indeed courageous pioneers. D had not just taught them technical nursing skills, but had instilled in them the basic ethic of the nursing profession, service to suffering mankind. Chua Thao is now a Hmong and American legend. She came to the U.S. and started the Hmong Nurses Association. Her story is told far and wide in newspapers and articles, on PBS, and in videos. She had an audience with President Ronald Reagan.
Living in the South Bay today, a Hmong refugee who had a very important role during the Secret War. She was recruited by the United States at a young age to become the first Hmong-trained nurse and would eventually use her position to empower other young women. Oh, yeah. Chua Thao shows me around the backyard of the Milpitas home she lives in, pointing out the plants used to heal. She's wearing a jacket with traditional Hmong embroidery.
80.
A far cry from the uniform she wore for many years, starting at 13 years old in Laos in the mid-1950s. While young Hmong men were being recruited by the CIA for the Secret War, Chua was tasked for something else. What were you recruited to do?
To go and study nurse.
The first Hmong-trained nurse who would be able to bridge cultural and language barriers at hospitals during a tumultuous time in that part of the world.
Because do not speak the language, so they're afraid they don't go to the hospital. I felt so good because I can do the job, and people, the old people, the nice people welcome me when we make a trip around and give medicine to people. And I was young, but I be able to talk to people because my father a leader, and I still have the leadership with me.
That leadership meant she learned not just French, but English too.
Scrabble.
Yeah.
So you learned English really well through Scrabble too.
Oh yeah, I was good and learned fast because I play Scrabble game with the nurse every night.
Eventually, Chua recruited other young women, mostly Hmong, counting
many classes, all in my brain.
Around 240 over the course of 8 years.
I had to teach them the alphabet. I had to teach them the Lao alphabet too. So they learn nursing and they learn how to read and write. Each time I recruit 30 nurses, 30 girls, and I train them for 1 year. I have a heart that encourage.
Chua and her growing family were in danger when the communists took over Laos. She landed in the U.S. in 1976 and ended up spending most of the later part of her life in social work, helping new refugees and immigrants in California and Minnesota. In Hmong, she says she thinks she was given this power to be able to help people, and she's happy she didn't shy away from that opportunity.
You weren't afraid you did.
Yeah.
Okay, so Chua, she is so fascinating, and I love speaking with her. And one of the things that didn't make the cut was she said, okay, one of the things I gave to my nurses as a reward was I let them watch an American film. And I said, well, what film was that? And she said, well, when the American pilots finished watching this film, then I would go take it and I'd show it to my students.
Which one?
It was The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. So she said, I've seen that film so many times.
My short video can never capture the depth of this story, and I encourage you to Google her name and see the many articles about her and the YouTube videos with her talking about her life and experiences. Dr. Weldon wrote a book called Tragedy in Paradise, A Country Doctor at War in Laos. The book publisher greatly condensed the book from the original manuscript, as all publishers do. But Dr. Weldon's daughter Becky gave me the original book file, which is massive, and has given me permission to release this chapter, which in the book was titled The Magnificent Seven. If you email me, I will send you the PDF of this chapter on these Hmong nurses. I decided, due to the length of this film, that I would instead provide you the YouTube link to Hoosier at the Front. It's a film only about 23 minutes, an incredible story about Pop Buell in Laos, Tongsar, his trusted aide who visits America with Pop, scenes of the nurses, the hospital, Dr. Weldon, villagers, soldiers, and more. I will close this video with a slideshow of remaining pictures. Thank you so much for watching.